The massive space station orbited Kepler Prime like a silver crown, floating in the darkness of space. Inside the Great Council chamber, delegates from across the galaxy took their assigned seats for another monthly meeting. The Zephyrians sat, tall and proud with their blue skin gleaming under the artificial lights. The Nexari hunched over their data tablets with their gray eyes focused on endless streams of information. The Korthak warriors stood at attention behind their table, their red armor polished to perfection. The Millennial Commerce Guild representatives counted profit margins on their portable devices, while the ancient Ethereal Collective floated in, their containment pods filled with glowing mist. Only one section remained empty. The human delegation's seats sat vacant for the first time in 23 years. No Ambassador Jake Morrison with his easy smile and difficult questions. No Dr. Lisa Harper with her thick research files and passionate speeches about ethics in science. No Captain Ben Rodriguez with his maps of patrol routes and his constant suggestions for military reforms. The empty chairs seemed to mock the assembled delegates, but nobody spoke about the absence. Speaker Veltar of the Zephyrian Empire called the meeting to order with a voice that carried across the chamber like thunder. His blue hands gestured toward the agenda display as he began reading the items for discussion. Trade regulations between the Outer Rim worlds, new mining rights in the asteroid fields, updates on military patrols in contested space. Everything proceeded exactly as it had for decades, except for the strange silence where human voices should have been raising concerns or proposing changes. 3 days earlier, Ambassador Morrison had quietly packed his belongings from his quarters on the station. His staff had done the same without fanfare or explanation. They had submitted their final reports, cleared their security access, and departed on the next transport to Earth. The only communication left behind was a brief diplomatic note that stated humanity was pursuing other interests and would no longer participate in Galactic Council activities. Nothing more. The Nexari delegate Kixtal adjusted his datapad and spoke in his mechanical voice about efficiency improvements in the communication networks. The Korthak General Zek Moore presented patrol schedules that covered less space than before, but nobody questioned the gaps. The Commerce Guild representative talked about profit increases in core worlds, while ignoring problems in frontier territories. The Ethereal Collective remained silent as always, communicating only through their strange mental projections that few species could interpret. As the meeting progressed, Veltar found himself relaxing in ways he had not experienced in years. No human delegate interrupted his presentations with awkward questions about fairness or justice. No one challenged the traditional methods that had served the galaxy for centuries. No one suggested radical changes to systems that worked perfectly, well for those who mattered. The harmony he had always dreamed of finally existed in the council chamber. The other delegates seemed to share his relief. The Nexari no longer had to defend their research projects from human ethical reviews. The Korthak could plan military operations without human interference about protecting civilian populations. The Commerce Guild could pursue profitable ventures without human complaints about worker conditions or environmental damage. The Ethereal Collective could maintain their ancient secrets without human scientists asking uncomfortable questions about their methods. During the break between sessions, quiet conversations took place in the corridors outside the chamber. Delegates expressed satisfaction that the unpredictable element had finally removed itself from their deliberations. Humans had always been the ones asking why things were done certain ways. They questioned traditions that had maintained stability for thousands of years. They proposed solutions to problems that most species had learned to accept as natural parts of existence. The Zephyrian economic advisor mentioned how much easier budget planning would be without human demands for funding their charity projects in underdeveloped sectors. The Nexari research coordinator spoke with relief about no longer having to justify every experiment to human ethics committees. The Korthak strategic planner celebrated the end of human objections to necessary military actions in troublesome regions. Far away on Earth, President Kate Sullivan stood in the Oval Office looking out at the gardens beyond the windows. Her cabinet members sat around the conference table discussing the final stages of humanity's withdrawal from galactic politics. The decision had not been made in anger or frustration, but in quiet disappointment after 2 decades of trying to reform a system that valued tradition over progress and stability over justice. Dr. Amy Foster, the new head of Earth's Department of Galactic Affairs, presented reports on colonial expansion into previously unexplored sectors. Captain Steve Turner, formerly of the Diplomatic Corps, outlined plans for independent exploration missions beyond the galaxy's mapped regions. Admiral Rick Collins discussed defensive preparations for Earth and the growing number of human colonies that no longer depended on Galactic Council protection. The president listened to each report with the calm expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and found peace with it. Humanity would focus on their own growth and development. They would explore new worlds and make contact with species that might value innovation and cooperation over rigid adherence to ancient protocols. The galaxy could continue as it always had, while humans built something better elsewhere. As the council meeting on Kepler Prime concluded, delegates returned to their ships with satisfaction that normal order had been restored. None of them noticed the small problems already beginning to appear in their daily reports. Systems running slightly less efficiently, patrol routes with gaps that seemed insignificant, research projects moving slower than expected, trade routes taking longer to optimize. The changes were tiny and easily overlooked by beings focused on maintaining the status quo rather than pursuing improvement. 2 months had passed since the humans left, and the first signs of trouble began appearing like small cracks in a dam. Captain Zekmore of the Korthak Empire stood before the military council with reports that made his red armor seem to lose its shine. Pirate raids in the Outer Rim territories had increased by 40%, and his forces struggled to respond to every attack. The patrol schedules that had worked for decades now left dangerous gaps in coverage that raiders exploited with growing boldness. The Korthak military had always prided itself on strength and honor in battle, but their ships moved slowly between distant star systems. Human patrol vessels had quietly filled those gaps, moving faster and covering more space than anyone realized. Captain Rodriguez and his fleet had handled protection duties across vast distances without ceremony or recognition. They had simply done the work because it needed doing, and now that work was left undone. Zekmore examined the star charts showing patrol routes and realized with growing horror that human ships had been covering 60% of anti-piracy operations throughout the galaxy. The humans had never boasted about this contribution or demanded credit for their efforts. They had integrated their patrols so seamlessly with Korthak operations that most officers assumed the coverage came from their own expanded fleet capabilities. Meanwhile, in the Nexari Technology Center, Chief Engineer Kickstall faced his first major crisis in 30 years of service. The quantum communication array that connected all Council worlds had suffered a critical component failure. The replacement part required a specific metallurgical process that combined rare elements in precise ratios under controlled atmospheric conditions. The Nexari had always assumed this knowledge was standard galactic technology available in any engineering database. 3 teams of Nexari engineers worked around the clock trying to recreate the manufacturing process. They had the chemical formulas and basic procedures, but lacked the subtle techniques that made the process actually work. Temperature variations that seemed insignificant caused the entire batch to fail. Timing adjustments of mere seconds resulted in materials that looked correct, but failed after hours of operation. The engineers grew increasingly frustrated as attempt after attempt produced useless components. Dr. Yilneth of the Ethereal Collective discovered similar problems in the medical research division. 17 ongoing projects had ground to a halt because they depended on surgical techniques and pharmaceutical compounds developed by human researchers. The procedures had seemed simple when human doctors demonstrated them, but proved impossible to replicate without proper training. Delicate operations that human surgeons performed routinely resulted in patient deaths when attempted by doctors from other species. The pharmaceutical compounds were even more puzzling. Human chemists had developed medications that worked better than traditional treatments, but the manufacturing processes contained steps that made no sense to non-human scientists. Why did the mixing have to be done in that specific order? Why did certain ingredients need to be added at body temperature, while others required near-freezing conditions? The humans had freely shared their knowledge when asked, but no one had bothered to ask about processes they assumed were primitive. The Commerce Guild faced different but equally troubling problems. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades now experienced delays and inefficiencies that cost millions of credits per day. Route optimization algorithms that calculated the fastest paths between star systems had somehow become less effective. Ships arrived late at their destinations or burned excessive fuel trying to maintain schedules. Guild investigators traced the problem to the central navigation system that all merchant vessels used for plotting courses. The software had been updated regularly over the years with improvements that increased efficiency and reduced travel times. Most of these updates had come from human mathematicians and computer specialists who contributed their work freely to the Galactic database. Without human input, the system had stopped evolving and slowly degraded as stellar positions shifted and space conditions changed. The updates had been so gradual and well integrated that no one realized how much the system depended on human innovations. Trade efficiency dropped by 30% across the galaxy as merchants struggled with outdated navigation data and suboptimal routing algorithms. Delivery schedules that had been reliable for years became unpredictable as ships took longer routes or encountered obstacles that better software would have avoided. In the Zephyrian agricultural sector, Dr. Keltar noticed unusual problems developing in the soil composition of farming worlds. Crop yields had begun declining on planets that had been productive for centuries. Laboratory analysis revealed that essential nutrients were being depleted faster than natural processes could replace them. The soil restoration techniques that had maintained fertility for generations were no longer working effectively. Investigation into historical records revealed that human botanist Dr. Alex Chen had quietly introduced improvements to soil management over the past decade. His methods had seemed crude to Zephyrian scientists who preferred technological solutions to biological problems. The humans used simple techniques like crop rotation, beneficial bacteria cultivation, and organic nutrient cycling that required no advanced equipment or energy expenditure. The Zephyrians had scorned these biological approaches as primitive throwbacks to pre-technological agriculture. They had continued using their traditional chemical enhancement methods, while the human techniques worked quietly in the background to maintain long-term soil health. Now, without those biological processes, the chemical methods alone proved insufficient to sustain productive farming. Back on Kepler Prime, Speaker Veltar received reports from all sectors, but initially dismissed the problems as temporary coincidences. Every civilization experienced occasional difficulties, and the Galactic Council had weathered many challenges over the centuries. Surely these minor issues would resolve themselves as they always had in the past. The speaker's confidence began to waver as more reports arrived daily. Communication delays between core worlds and frontier territories, medical emergencies that should have been routine becoming fatal complications, military responses that arrived too late to help attacked colonies, trade disputes that escalated because diplomatic solutions took longer to implement. Each problem seemed small and manageable when considered individually, but together they created a pattern that disturbed even Veltar's unshakable faith in traditional methods. The humans had been gone for only 2 months, but their absence was creating ripple effects throughout galactic civilization. Systems that had operated smoothly for decades were showing signs of strain and inefficiency. The other council members began having private conversations about whether they should consider reaching out to Earth. Pride prevented them from admitting mistakes, but practical concerns grew stronger each day as problems multiplied across their territories. None of them wanted to be the first to suggest that perhaps the humans had been more valuable than anyone realized. 6 months after the humans departed, the cracks had become chasms that threatened to swallow entire civilizations. The Zephyrian agricultural crisis had spread beyond individual farming worlds to entire sectors as soil restoration failures cascaded through interconnected ecosystems. Dr. Keltar stood in what had once been fertile fields on the planet Zephyr 7, watching crops wither despite every technological intervention his people could devise. The human botanist Alex Chen had developed his soil techniques through patient observation and experimentation that spanned decades. He had studied how different plants affected soil chemistry and how beneficial microorganisms created sustainable nutrient cycles. His methods worked with natural processes instead of fighting against them, creating agricultural systems that became more productive over time rather than depleting the land. 12 Zephyrian worlds now faced potential famine as their chemically enhanced soils collapsed without the biological foundation that human techniques had quietly maintained. Millions of Zephyrians abandoned their homeworlds, fleeing to already overcrowded core planets that struggled to feed the sudden influx of refugees. The proud agricultural empire that had fed half the galaxy for centuries could barely sustain its own population. The Nexari research station orbiting Nexus Prime became the site of the worst industrial accident in galactic history when containment protocols failed during an experiment with unstable matter. The explosion should have been prevented by safety systems that had protected researchers for generations. Investigation revealed that the emergency procedures had been largely based on human safety innovations that were integrated so seamlessly into standard operations that no one remembered their origin. Dr. Sarah Kim had spent years studying industrial accidents across different species and civilizations. She had identified patterns of failure that seemed obvious once pointed out, but had been invisible to engineers focused on their own specialties. Her safety protocols combined technological safeguards with human intuition about how complex systems actually behaved under stress rather than how they were supposed to behave according to theoretical models. 43 of the galaxy's most brilliant scientists died in an accident that human protocols would have prevented. The Nexari government ordered all dangerous research suspended until new safety systems could be developed, but their engineers struggled to recreate human innovations that had saved countless lives over the decades. Without those protections, scientific progress slowed to a crawl as researchers became afraid to pursue projects that might involve any risk. The Korthak Empire suffered its worst military defeat in centuries when their battle fleet encountered an unknown aggressive species in the Andromeda approach. The aliens fought with tactics that violated every principle of honorable warfare that Korthak strategists understood. They used deception, misdirection, and technological adaptation that made traditional responses useless against their unconventional methods. General Zekmor had dismissed human military advisors as cowards who preferred clever tricks to honest battle. Captain Rodriguez and his staff had constantly advocated for adaptive strategy protocols that could respond to unexpected enemy tactics. They had insisted that rigid adherence to proven methods was a weakness that clever opponents would exploit without mercy. The Korthak fleet was destroyed not because their warriors lacked courage, but because their strategies could not adapt to enemies who refused to fight according to established rules. The survivors who escaped back to Korthak space brought stories of human-style tactics used against them by aliens who had learned that conventional approaches were predictable and therefore defeatable. Environmental systems across multiple worlds began showing signs of catastrophic failure as atmospheric processors struggled to maintain breathable air for billions of inhabitants. Water purification networks that had operated flawlessly for centuries started producing contaminated supplies. That caused widespread illness. Ecosystem management programs designed to maintain planetary climates began breaking down as natural cycles fell out of balance. Investigation teams discovered that these vital systems had been continuously maintained and improved by human environmental engineers working quietly throughout the galaxy. The humans had never claimed credit for their contributions because they saw environmental protection as a basic responsibility rather than an achievement deserving recognition. They had simply done the work because planetary ecosystems required constant attention to remain stable. Without human innovation and problem-solving, infrastructure began to crumble in ways that seemed impossible to prevent. Atmospheric processors designed to last for millennia failed after months without proper maintenance. Water treatment facilities that had never required attention suddenly needed daily repairs to function at all. Climate control systems that regulated temperature and weather patterns across entire continents began producing dangerous storms and temperature extremes. The cascade effects spread beyond technical failures to social and economic collapse as populations lost faith in their government's ability to provide basic services. Refugee movements from failing worlds created instability in previously peaceful regions. Trade networks broke down as merchant guilds lost confidence in the safety of shipping routes and planetary infrastructure. Captain Steve Turner, formerly of the Human Diplomatic Corps, received desperate communications from representatives of multiple council species. The messages arrived through unofficial channels because none of the species wanted to admit publicly that they needed human help. Each representative offered substantial concessions in exchange for limited technical assistance or advisory services. Turner brought these communications to President Sullivan, but Earth's government had instituted a strict non-interference policy regarding former council territories. Humanity was committed to building new relationships with species that valued cooperation and innovation rather than returning to patterns that had proven frustrating and ultimately futile. The human colonial expansion program had exceeded all expectations as exploration fleets discovered habitable worlds throughout previously uncharted regions. New colonies thrived under environmental management techniques that created sustainable ecosystems from the beginning rather than trying to repair damage after it occurred. The colonists worked with local conditions instead of imposing alien technology that might disrupt natural processes. Human explorers had also made peaceful contact with 7 new species that showed genuine interest in cooperative development, rather than domination or exploitation. These species appreciated human willingness to share knowledge freely and adapt their methods to work with different biological and technological approaches. The relationships developing with these new allies were based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than the rigid hierarchy that had characterized the Galactic Council. Dr. Amy Foster released a carefully worded statement explaining humanity's position to anyone who cared to listen. Earth bore no ill will toward the former council species, but had no intention of returning to an organization that had valued their contributions so little that their absence went unnoticed until systems began failing. Humanity was committed to building something better based on principles of innovation, cooperation, and mutual benefit. The statement included documentation of every dismissal, every instance where human innovations had been adopted without credit, and every occasion where human proposals for improvement had been rejected in favor of maintaining traditional methods. The humans had quietly prepared for independence while hoping that attitudes would change within the council. When it became clear that progress was impossible within the existing system, they had chosen to pursue their own destiny among the stars. 1 year after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council faced multiple simultaneous crises that threatened the very foundation of their civilization. The Outer Rim territories had declared independence from central authority after months of inadequate protection from increasingly bold pirate raids. 3 entire sectors had formed their own defensive confederation, refusing to pay taxes to governments that could not guarantee basic security for their citizens. The Nexari civilization was experiencing something their species had never known: in 10,000 years of recorded history. Technological regression. Advanced research facilities sat empty because scientists lacked the safety protocols needed to conduct dangerous experiments. Manufacturing centers that had produced sophisticated equipment for centuries could no longer replicate components that required human-developed processes. The Nexari were slowly losing access to their own technology as equipment failed and could not be replaced. The Zephyrian Empire had fragmented into competing factions as agricultural worlds collapsed and refugee populations overwhelmed remaining productive planets. Civil war erupted between traditionalist factions that insisted on maintaining ancient farming methods and desperate groups willing to try anything that might restore their agricultural capacity. 12 worlds that had once fed billions now supported barely a tenth of their original populations. Speaker Veltar abandoned all pretense of dignity when he sent a private communication directly to Admiral Rick Collins on Earth. The message offered unprecedented concessions if humanity would consider returning to the Council. Complete control over military strategic planning, unlimited funding for human research projects, territorial grants that would give Earth authority over entire star systems. The speaker's blue hands trembled as he recorded the message that represented everything his people had sworn never to surrender. Admiral Collins received the communication in his office, overlooking the expanded Naval Academy, where Earth's new generation of explorers trained for missions beyond the galaxy's mapped regions. He studied the desperate offers with the same careful attention he had once given to Council military briefings. The concessions were substantial and would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier, when humans had been treated as junior partners whose opinions carried little weight. The Admiral's response was polite but firm. Humanity appreciated the recognition of their contributions, but remained committed to their new path of independent exploration and development. Earth's colonial expansion program had established thriving settlements in the Magellanic Clouds, where human techniques for sustainable development created prosperous communities that grew stronger each year. Humanity had found something better than reforming a broken system. The response included footage of human colonies that seemed impossible to Council observers, cities that worked in harmony with local ecosystems instead of displacing them. Agricultural systems that improved soil quality over time rather than depleting it. Manufacturing processes that produced no waste because every byproduct served a useful purpose in other operations. The humans had not simply survived their departure from galactic civilization, but had created societies that surpassed anything the Council had achieved. The Korthak Empire made the mistake of believing they could force humanity to return through military pressure. General Zekmor convinced his government that a show of strength would demonstrate human dependence on Council protection and force them to negotiate from weakness. The Korthak fleet that entered human space was the largest military force ever assembled by their empire, with enough firepower to devastate entire star systems. The raid fleet encountered defensive technologies that seemed to violate known laws of physics. Human ships moved with impossible speed and agility, while weapon systems displayed capabilities that exceeded anything in Council databases. The battle was so one-sided that Korthak historians would later debate whether it qualified as combat or merely a demonstration of superior technology. Not a single human vessel was lost, while the entire Korthak fleet was systematically disabled, through precise strikes that left the ships intact but completely powerless. The Korthak warriors found themselves drifting helplessly in space until human rescue vessels arrived to provide life support and basic repairs. The humans sent the fleet home with a polite message suggesting that the Korthak focus their energy on solving internal problems rather than creating new conflicts. The demonstration of human military advancement sent shockwaves through Council territories. Species that had viewed humanity as a minor technological power realized that Earth had been concealing capabilities that made them potentially the most formidable military force in the galaxy. The humans had chosen to leave peacefully rather than use their advantages to dominate other species. which made their departure even more troubling for council leaders. Dr. Amy Foster held a press conference that was broadcast across human space and intercepted by intelligence services throughout the former council territories. She explained humanity's position with the calm confidence of someone representing a civilization that had found its proper place in the universe. Earth bore no ill will toward other species, but would not return to patterns of cooperation that had proven frustrating and ultimately futile. The statement revealed that humans had been documenting every slight and dismissal during their years in the council. They had recorded instances where their innovations were adopted without credit and their proposals were rejected without consideration. The humans had quietly prepared for independence while hoping that attitudes would change, but had finally accepted that the council valued stability over progress and tradition over innovation. Humanity was now focused on building relationships with species that shared their values of adaptation and mutual cooperation. The 7 new alien civilizations that had joined humanity's confederation were described as refreshing partners who appreciated creative solutions to complex problems. These species valued the human approach of questioning established methods and seeking better ways to achieve shared goals. The press conference included testimonials from representatives of humanity's new allies who spoke enthusiastically about working with beings who prioritized results over protocol. They described human colonies as examples of what civilizations could achieve when innovation was encouraged rather than suppressed. The contrast with council territories, where rigid adherence to ancient methods had led to stagnation and decline, was clear to any observer. President Sullivan appeared at the end of the broadcast to address former council species directly. She acknowledged that many individuals within those civilizations were good people who deserved better than the collapse they were experiencing. Earth remained open to relationships with groups or individuals who demonstrated genuine commitment to cooperative development and mutual respect. However, humanity would not return to the council system that had wasted decades of potential progress. They had learned that some organizations could not be reformed from within and required replacement with better alternatives. The humans were building that alternative among the stars and welcomed any species willing to embrace change over tradition and innovation over stagnation. 18 months after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council faced complete institutional collapse as member civilizations abandoned the organization that had once united half the galaxy under a single governing body. The Outer Rim Confederation had grown from 3 rebellious sectors to encompass dozens of star systems that formed their own democratic alliance based on principles of mutual aid and shared defense rather than hierarchical control from distant core worlds. Several Nexari research colonies broke away from their home government to pursue independent scientific development, free from the technological stagnation that plagued their original civilization. These breakaway groups sought to recreate the innovative environment they had observed in human territories before the departure. They established experimental communities where researchers could pursue dangerous projects with proper safety protocols and share discoveries freely rather than hoarding knowledge for political advantage. The Zephyrian Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. Competing factions controlled fragments of former imperial territory, while millions of refugees wandered between star systems, seeking any world that could provide basic food and shelter. The agricultural techniques that had sustained their civilization for millennia proved inadequate without the biological foundation that human innovations had quietly maintained for decades. Emergency sessions became daily events in the council chamber as delegates desperately tried to address cascading failures across their remaining territories. Speaker Veltar had aged visibly during the crisis, his blue skin taking on a gray pallor that reflected his people's declining fortunes. The other delegates showed similar signs of stress as they struggled with problems that seemed to multiply faster than solutions could be implemented. The delegates finally admitted what they had refused to acknowledge for over a year. humans, had been the invisible foundation that held galactic civilization together through constant innovation, problem-solving, and quiet competence. The Council had functioned not because of their ancient wisdom and traditional methods, but because human adaptability had compensated for systemic flaws that became apparent only after their stabilizing influence disappeared. Ambassador Jake Morrison received formal invitations from every remaining Council species offering concessions that would have been impossible to imagine during his years of service. Permanent human leadership of all military councils with authority to restructure defense strategies according to human principles. Complete control over research priorities and funding allocation for scientific development across Council territories. Veto power over any legislation that humans considered contrary to principles of innovation and progress. The territorial grants offered to humanity exceeded the size of some member civilizations. Earth would receive administrative authority over entire star systems with the right to implement human governance methods and environmental policies. The offers grew more desperate as conditions worsened, and Council leaders realized that their traditional approaches were inadequate for the challenges they faced. Morrison brought these offers to President Sullivan, but her response was immediate and definitive. Humanity was no longer interested in reforming the Council because they had discovered something far better through independent exploration and cooperation with species who valued innovation over tradition. The Human Confederation had grown into a thriving alliance that made decisions based on merit and effectiveness rather than ancient protocols. Secretary John Walsh delivered Earth's formal response to the Council offers during a broadcast that reached every inhabited world in known space. The message was simple but devastating in its implications for the former galactic order. Humanity had moved beyond the need for Council membership because they had found partners who shared their values and supported their methods rather than constantly opposing them. The broadcast included footage from human colonies that demonstrated technologies and social systems that exceeded anything the Council had achieved during centuries of cooperation between multiple advanced civilizations. Cities powered entirely by renewable energy sources that worked in harmony with local ecosystems. Agricultural systems that increased soil fertility while producing abundant food for growing populations. Manufacturing processes that created useful products without generating waste or pollution. Most impressive were the testimonials from the 7 alien species that had joined humanity's confederation. These beings spoke with genuine enthusiasm about working with humans who approached problems with creativity and flexibility, rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. They described collaborative projects that had achieved breakthrough solutions to challenges that had seemed impossible using traditional methods. The revelation that humanity was not only surviving but thriving without Council membership sent shockwaves through the remaining member territories. Species that had assumed humans needed galactic civilization for technological and economic support discovered that Earth had actually been providing more benefits than they received. The human departure had revealed the Council's dependence on human contributions rather than proving human dependence on Council resources. The final blow to Council credibility came when the Outer Rim Confederation announced their intention to request alliance with humanity's growing interstellar community. The independent territories that had declared freedom from Council authority now sought partnership with the very organization that Earth had created as an alternative to galactic government. They offered to adopt human principles of governance and environmental management in exchange for inclusion in the Confederation. Other breakaway groups followed the Outer Rim example as former Council territories sought to join the Human Alliance rather than remain loyal to their original governments. The exodus accelerated as populations learned about life in human colonies where individual creativity was encouraged and social systems adapted to serve actual needs rather than maintaining traditional hierarchies. President Sullivan faced difficult decisions as requests for Confederation membership arrived from across the galaxy. Earth's government had learned from their Council experience to carefully evaluate potential allies for genuine compatibility with human principles rather than accepting all applicants regardless of their commitment to cooperative development and mutual respect. Some former council species began the long process of internal reform necessary to qualify for consideration as Confederation partners. They established democratic institutions that emphasized individual rights and social mobility. They adopted environmental policies that prioritized sustainability over short-term economic gains. They restructured their educational systems to encourage innovation and critical thinking rather than memorization of traditional knowledge. Other species clung to the hierarchical methods that had led to their current difficulties, hoping that somehow the old ways would eventually restore their former prosperity. These civilizations faced continued decline as their rigid systems proved incapable of adapting to changed circumstances. They became cautionary examples of what happened when organizations valued tradition over effectiveness. The galaxy was learning a harsh lesson about the importance of flexibility and innovation in maintaining complex civilizations. The quiet competence that they had taken for granted during humanity's council membership had been the foundation upon which everything else depended. Without that stabilizing influence, the impressive achievements of galactic civilization proved to be far more fragile than anyone had realized. 2 years after humanity's quiet departure from the Galactic Council, the organization that had governed half the galaxy for over a millennium officially dissolved during a final emergency session, attended by only a handful of desperate delegates. The great chamber that had once hosted representatives from dozens of thriving civilizations now echoed with the footsteps of the few remaining officials who gathered to sign documents formally ending an institution that had already ceased to function in any meaningful way. The Nexari civilization had fragmented into 47 independent research enclaves scattered across former imperial territory as scientists abandoned centralized control in favor of smaller communities that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. These groups struggled to maintain even basic technology as their manufacturing capabilities degraded without access to human-developed processes that had been integrated so thoroughly into their industrial systems that removing them caused systematic collapse. The Korthak Empire had reverted to feudalism as their centralized military structure crumbled under the weight of defeats that shattered their warrior culture's confidence in traditional combat methods. Local warlords claimed individual star systems and fought bitter campaigns against neighbors using increasingly primitive weapons as their technological infrastructure failed. The proud empire that had once enforced order across vast territories now could barely maintain peace within individual planetary systems. The Zephyrian worlds lay largely abandoned as environmental collapse made most of their former agricultural planets uninhabitable for large populations. The few surviving communities existed as subsistence farmers using hand tools and techniques that predated their technological civilization. Billions of refugees had fled to other regions of the galaxy, seeking shelter among species that could barely support their own populations after years of systematic decline. The Millennial Commerce Guild existed only in historical records as trade networks collapsed and merchant families either joined human territories or established small independent operations in regions where basic commerce remained possible. The sophisticated financial systems that had coordinated galactic economy for centuries proved useless without the underlying infrastructure that human innovations had quietly maintained. Former Speaker Veltar arrived at Earth leading a final delegation that included representatives from every surviving remnant of the former Council civilizations. The Zephyrian looked ancient despite his species' natural longevity, bearing the weight of failure that had destroyed everything his people had built over thousands of years. The other delegates showed similar signs of defeat as they approached. Humanity's homeworld with gifts and formal requests that represented their civilization's last hope for survival. The delegation brought technological treasures from their respective cultures, along with complete databases of scientific knowledge accumulated over millennia of development. They offered these resources freely to humanity along with formal recognition of human leadership in any new galactic organization. The gifts represented everything of value their civilizations still possessed, surrendered without negotiation in desperate attempts to secure human assistance. President Kate Sullivan, now serving her second term leading Earth's government, received the delegation with courtesy but without the enthusiasm they had hoped to see. She listened patiently as each representative made their case for human leadership of a reformed galactic government built around principles of innovation and merit-based decision-making rather than traditional hierarchical control. The former speaker presented the delegation's final offer with hands that trembled from exhaustion and stress. Humanity would receive complete authority over all aspects of galactic governance, including military command, research direction, and territorial administration. No decisions would be made without human approval, and all policies would reflect human values of adaptation and progress. The survivors of former Council civilizations would serve as willing subordinates in whatever system humanity chose to establish. President Sullivan's response was delivered with the calm firmness of a leader who had guided her people through their transformation from junior council partners to masters of their own destiny among the stars. She thanked the delegation for their recognition of human capabilities, but explained that the opportunity for such cooperation had passed beyond recovery. Humanity had spent 20 years trying to reform the council from within, while their suggestions were ignored and their contributions were dismissed. The window for reconciliation had closed when the council species chose tradition over innovation and stability over justice. Earth had moved beyond the need for galactic government because they had built something better with partners who shared their values from the beginning rather than adopting them only after catastrophic failure forced recognition of their effectiveness. The president gestured toward displays showing human colonies throughout the galaxy, where sustainable cities thrived in harmony with local ecosystems and populations grew prosperous through cooperative development. These communities represented what civilizations could achieve when innovation was encouraged rather than suppressed, and when decisions were made based on effectiveness rather than adherence to ancient protocols. The final scene of the Great Transformation showed the delegation's departure from Earth, while in the background, human ships launched toward distant galaxies carrying mixed crews of humans and their alien allies. Captain Rachel White commanded the exploration vessel UES Discovery as it prepared for departure to the Andromeda Galaxy, leading an expedition that included representatives from all 7 species that had joined humanity's confederation. The humans were no longer looking backward toward the galactic civilization they had left behind, but forward toward unlimited possibilities among the stars. Their ships carried advanced technologies that exceeded anything the former council had, possessed along with social systems that created prosperity without exploitation and scientific methods that pursued knowledge without causing harm. Earth received a message from the Outer Rim Confederation requesting formal alliance with humanity's interstellar community. The former council territories that had declared independence now sought to join the organization that represented everything they had hoped the Galactic Council might become. The request included detailed plans for adopting human principles of governance and environmental management as proof of their commitment to genuine cooperation. Similar requests arrived daily from breakaway groups and reformed civilizations across the galaxy as species learned about life in human territories where individual creativity was valued and social systems adapted to serve actual needs rather than maintaining traditional hierarchies. The exodus from former council territories accelerated as populations discovered alternatives to the rigid systems that had led to widespread failure. President Sullivan and her advisors faced the complex task of evaluating each application for Confederation membership with careful attention to genuine compatibility rather than desperate need. Earth had learned from their council experience that true cooperation required shared values and mutual respect rather than mere convenience or political necessity. Some former council species demonstrated sincere commitment to reform by establishing democratic institutions, and adopting sustainable development practices that showed they understood the principles behind human success. These groups began the gradual process of earning consideration for partnership through consistent behavior rather than desperate promises. Others remained trapped in the thinking patterns that had caused their original difficulties, hoping that somehow traditional methods would eventually restore their former prosperity if they could just gain access to human technology and guidance. These civilizations continued their decline as cautionary examples of what happened when organizations valued appearance over substance and tradition over effectiveness. The galaxy had learned its lesson about taking quiet competence for granted, but the education had come too late for redemption. The foundation upon which galactic civilization had depended was gone forever, scattered among the stars in human ships that carried the seeds of something far better than what had been lost.